Hi, welcome. Lifestyle management, we're going to be looking at environmentally healthy. That's chapter 16. Now, we all have a personal responsibility for safeguarding the health of our environment and our own well-being. Now, this chapter offers us the opportunity to become more environmentally aware. Now, I am aware, of course, that many of you probably already are. So this will be a review for many of you and also just a bit more of an update. Now, we're going to explore the complex interrelationship between our world and our well-being and what is being done to support environmental sustainability. Now, all of us are able to stand up, take notice, and put into an action plan into place that regard the current environmental issues. Okay, so let's get started with why is this chapter important to health sciences? So we're going to look at and review some of the environmental awareness issues. And let's begin with environmental awareness. And we'll start with just a general overview. And this is an important beginning point because oftentimes it gets misunderstood. You know, the planet Earth is now seen as a single fragile ecosystem, a community of organisms that share a physical, chemical environment. Now, while technology continues to raise the standard of living in industrialized countries, often it does so at a terrible environmental cost. And we'll explore some of that in a moment, okay? Now, in 2016, Canada ranked 25th out of 180 countries with regard to its Environmental Performance Index, or the EPI. Now, the EPI is defined as a country's ordered rank relative to other organizations of the Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, and other member countries a part of that same organization. Okay? So when we're ranked 25th out of 180, that sounds and is fairly good. Maybe we could be doing better. And that's the point of what this chapter is about. So let's look at climate change. Now, climate change involves variations within the Earth's atmosphere, the temperature and the humidity of the air, the rainfall, the strength of the winds, the clouds, and variations in solar radiation, the Earth's orbit, and greenhouse gas concentrations. So just on that element alone, the interconnectivity of so many things that we either take for granted, the temperature, the winds, rain, or the things that we don't really pay much attention to, solar radiation, are all part of that which we call climate change in our world. Now, the most recent research is showing that catastrophic changes to the planet could result in the amount from the amount of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So could be putting more of that into the atmosphere. Now, life on Earth is possible because of solar radiation of the sun and the Earth's atmosphere. Solar radiation passes through the Earth's atmosphere, which is made up of greenhouse gases. Now, therein lies part of the crux for some people's misunderstandings, is that greenhouse gases in and of themselves aren't all bad. In fact, they protect us from some of the solar radiation that is put out by the sun. CO2 is the most important gas in this insulation air. It acts like glass in the greenhouse, allowing a small amount of the solar radiation through the Earth's atmosphere and trapping it in so that heat warms the Earth. The rest of the radiation is bounced back into space, and this is what's called the greenhouse effect. Now, if you're a gardener, you know the greenhouse effect is a good thing. If you have a greenhouse, it's good to keep the heat in that greenhouse that allows the plants to grow healthfully. Gives you an earlier start in gardening in the spring, allows you to even garden throughout the year. So it's not all bad. But let's look a little deeper into it. Now, human activities have introduced climate forcings, they're called. Research from the Suzuki Foundation suggests that we have released as much carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide, into the atmosphere that we are now covered by a thick heat-trapping blanket. And this is what's known as the enhanced greenhouse effect. So it's now keeping more heat in, and this is what you start to hear about with climate change and global warming, is that the temperatures in the world are warming and all the effects associated with that. Now, there's growing consensus among climate change scientists that the main culprit of greenhouse gas emissions is CO2, and that's produced from the burning of fossil fuels, and the foremost reason for global warming. There are other sources, of course, but this is considered one of the most important ones. You can see from the greenhouse emissions by provinces on page 425, you find that in your textbook. Now, Canada has a long way to go to tackle our greenhouse gas emissions and deal with the climate change. There's a number of issues that precipitate larger issues. The greenhouse gases that are produced by our coal production, the greenhouse gases associated with our fossil fuels use. Now, global warming is an important measure of climate change, and it's defined as sustained increases in the average temperature of the Earth's atmosphere that cause changes in the global climate. The average global temperature in 2015 was the warmest on record, and the most of a global warming has occurred in the last 35 years. You can also check out the graphics on page 426, figure 613, for some of the reasons why the world is heating up. Now, some of the impacts that we could find through global warming. No one can forecast exactly what the effects of the continuing temperature rise will be, but some experts have predicted severe drought and the rise in ocean levels of 0.6 meters, which is about 2 feet, to about 6 meters, which is about 20 feet. Now, if you imagine if you live near water, particularly oceans, 6 feet rise could mean miles of land under the water. And if you live in New York, you live in Florida, you live down in the south in Texas, in California, in BC, that kind of level raise can mean a huge devastation to large populations of people. A warmer world is expected to produce more severe flooding in some places and more severe droughts in others, jeopardizing natural resources and the safety of our water supply. And we're already seeing examples of that. Huge heat waves have created droughts down in the States, over in California. Looked at the huge water problems in terms of severe storms in India. We can see the water supply issues. They're talking about it in South Africa around the water supply of fresh water is diminishing. Warm weather worsens urban industrial air pollution and increases concentrations of allergen pollution, and fungi spores. Extreme weather events have already become a reality around the globe. Heat waves have become more and more frequent. The heat waves in both 2003 and 2010 in Europe, causing thousands of deaths and destroying wheat crops. Scientists estimate that the world would become hotter within 100 years. Now, from my perspective, I don't think just in terms of me, but what can I do today to help stem that, but also in terms of my family, in terms of my grandchild and my great-grandchildren who will ultimately be around at that time. So what can we do to protect the planet? Now, you can look at it at an individual, what can we each do individually, but we can also wonder what is the world doing? So we're going to look at international initiatives. Now, I'm only going to review the main lineage of these international initiatives. You'll find these all in your textbook, and we're going to begin with the Kyoto Protocol. Now, you may have heard of that term being bandied about more recently, but it started quite a bit back in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in 1997, and 165 nations signed on the Kyoto Agreement in 2001. Kyoto committed some 40 industrialized nations to limit carbon emissions or reduce them to levels below that of 1990. Now, on February 16, 2005, the Kyoto Protocol officially became into force. Now, although Canada was a signatory to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and legally required to meet the Kyoto targets by 2012, in October of 2006, the Canadian government at the time opted to introduce Canada's Clean Air Act and subsequently Eco Action Plan as an alternative plan. Then, in 2011, Canada indicated that it would pull out of the Kyoto Agreement after the first phase expired in 2012. Doesn't sound particularly what you'd have in mind that Canada would do. The Canadian plan to meet the country's targets included mandatory cutbacks in emissions for large factories and power plants, updated standards for the energy efficient buildings and homes and vehicles and appliances, financial incentives for smaller businesses to cut emissions, and tax breaks or financial supports for public transit and alternative fuels, all of which was aimed at reducing these emissions. Now, following the Kyoto Agreement, the Bali Action Plan. Now, the Bali Climate Convention of 2007 laid a roadmap for the post-Kyoto Protocol Agreement for developed countries. Discussions surrounded around how to persist in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and how to best assist developing countries to adapt to climate change, how to fund and use technology to shift to low carbon development. So this was now starting to reach beyond the developed countries and moved into developing countries and some technologies that could help reduce these emissions. In 2009, we had the Copenhagen Accord. The goal of this international meeting was to finalize the Bali Action Plan and to prepare for the expiry of the Kyoto Protocol in 2012. It resulted in a treaty that was not legally binding, but it offered outlines for the future. Then we had Rio Plus 20. Now, the Rio Plus 20, this was a UN Convention on Sustainable Development, Rio Plus 20, and it was held in 2012 in Rio de Janeiro. That's in Brazil, for those of you who may not know. The process to develop a set of sustainable development goals was started at this time, and the guidelines on green economy policies were adopted. Participants formulated an agreement to strengthen the United Nations Environmental Program and establish a political forum for sustainable development. Now, there's a 10-year framework of programs that would focus on sustainable consumption, and production patterns were achieved. Most noticeable was the attention to of the world on this conference, and the remainder of the climate change needs continued partnerships to advance sustainable development. The worry was that things might start to relax, and this was a continued attempt to keep things motivated and moving in the direction of helping reduce global warming emissions. This was followed by the Paris Agreement. Now, this became more notable again. Now, in December 12, 2015, the new international treaty, the Paris Agreement, was signed by delegates at the 21st session of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The long-term goal of this agreement is to keep the rise of global warming below 2 degrees centigrade and strive to keep it within 1.5 degrees centigrade. The Canadian government is supporting the goal of 1.5 degrees centigrade. So the intention here is to slow and stop climate change from growing, to keep it, if it's going to continue to grow, within 1.5 centigrade per year. Try to keep it lower than that and keep it within that over the sustained period, not have it grow up. Other commitments include the expectation that all countries will do their best to reach nationally determined contributions. This is known as the NDC, Nationally Determined Contributions. Review and commit to new NDCs every 5 years. Call on developed nations, so richer nations, to provide funds to enable developing countries to reduce climate change, publish greenhouse gas reduction targets, and to move forward on carbon neutrality by the year 2050. So this was a renewed commitment for long-term objectives, not just by the rich countries, but by developing countries. Now, a program that was instituted, or another component that's instituted, was called carbon offsets and cap and trade. Carbon offsets are defined as credits for greenhouse reduction and have been promoted as one way to achieve carbon neutrality. Now, carbon neutrality is about not producing any more. So here's how that would work. Businesses who are selling energy efficient projects could sell carbon offsets. We're providing you with resources to reduce your carbon output. Individuals who wanted to compensate their own greenhouse gas emissions, such as taking an airplane flight, huge carbon being produced by airplanes, can purchase carbon offsets as a way of supporting global sustainability. Cap and trade is a tested and proven system for reducing pollution. So really what you're doing is you're saying, I have some to give. I've created some savings on my emissions by reducing my emissions, and I have some credit to give. If you, as an alternative, haven't done that yet, but you're working toward it, but you have things you want to do, you can purchase some of my credit. And therefore, while you're doing something that's producing emissions, I have sold you those extra credits that I have reduced. So it's kind of like a cap and trade. Okay? Now, I know this isn't something that maybe you're all cognizant of, but it's good information to have, to know that there is efforts being made, albeit it's a big task, but it recognizes the number of countries that are working towards this, in spite of some of the rhetoric that we are hearing from other countries where it's not an issue. The system requires that an organization, a region, a province, or a country sets responsible limits for greenhouse emissions and attempts to lower the emissions over time. The cap is the legal limit for the greenhouse gas emissions that can be emitted each year. The trade is the legal agreement between companies where they may swap among themselves the permissions and permits to emit greenhouse gases. So the levels remain the same, even though there's still some emissions. By capping and trading, we try to keep those emissions at a consistent lower level. All right, how about a call to action, the environmental advocacy? What can we do? What have other smaller maybe organizations done, not at an international level? And we can begin with the Indigenous Environmental Network. The Indigenous Environmental Network, the IEN, is a circle of indigenous people who came together because of the environmental concerns such as clear-cutting in forests, herbicides, dams, oil and gas explorations in sensitive areas. And the mission of the IEN is to protect and restore the harmony of life throughout traditional values. Now, there have been many positive changes in Canada because of the actions of the members of the IEN. But they're not the only group working, or the only people working towards positive change. Sierra Club BC. Since 1969, Sierra Club BC has been working to protect and preserve British Columbia's natural wilderness and wildlife. It also wants to ensure BC is a global leader when tackling climate change. Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson is an author of Silent Spring. This was authored in 1962, and she alerted us to the consequences of attempting to control nature with the use of poisonous chemicals to kill insects. Carson challenged the practices of agricultural sciences and the U.S. government and called for new policies to protect human health and our environment. Reminds us that environmental advocacy isn't just a new thing. Al Gore. Al Gore is the former Vice President of the United States. He's an environmental activist and author who believes that climate change issue is one of the most important moral issues of our time. Now, you might be familiar with his book. In 2006, Gore wrote a book, and it was called The Inconvenient Truth. It also came out as a bit of a movie, and it was a TED Talk. The Planetary Emergency of Global Warming and What We Can Do About It. The book was made into one of the top documentaries in history and won an Academy Award. In 2007, Gord was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and he shared with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and given for the efforts to build and disseminate greater knowledge about human-made climate change. Another person you may not know, Ian McTaggart-Cowan. McTaggart-Cowan is known as the father of Canadian ecology and was a wildlife biologist and naturalist. During his 35-year tenure as a professor at the University of British Columbia, he founded the first university-based wildlife department in Canada, and his efforts became the foundation for wildlife environmental education in Canada. He also pioneered nature television in the 1950s, which changed the way the North Americans understood the important connection between nature world, or the natural world, and human actions. We can also consider a more familiar name that you've probably heard of, David Suzuki. Now, Suzuki, he's internationally renowned. He's a Canadian scientist, he's an academic, he's a broadcaster, a writer, and he's the founder of the David Suzuki Foundation. Now, he's considered to be one of North America's leading environmentalists. Dr. Suzuki, he continues to encourage individual action to change the world. He suggests that there is 10 ways that we can make a difference. And you'll find these on page 430. I'm only going to list them. But these are things that we individually can do to make a difference. Queen of Green. Take action. Eat for healthy oceans. Recycle your electronics. Green your workplace. Reduce your carbon footprint. Food and our planet. Connect with nature. Be a citizen scientist, and try 30 by 30 nature challenge. Give some of those a try. It might be exciting for you to try and see what you can do. Another individual, Andrew Weaver. Dr. Andrew Weaver is a world-class climatologist, professor, and first ever elected Green Party MLA. And he developed the Earth System climate model that is now used by scientists around the world to study climate change. Now, when we talk about models, we don't mean physical models. These are computer-generated models about how weather moves around the Earth, how the system of weather moves through the Earth. And that helps understand how gases also move throughout and around the world. Weaver was already a lead author in the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and has won many academic and research awards. Dr. Weaver is a prolific writer of peer-reviewed scientific papers and 2 books on the environment. So there's been a lot of good work done by a great deal of people, and this is only a small representation. So what about greening the college and university campuses? Environmental sustainability is a new movement at colleges and universities where some students are basing their decisions on which institutions to attend on sustainable institution, or how sustainable institutions are. Now, students are forming environmental organizations. As college and university students, you have an opportunity to make a change, to change your academic institution. Look around, find out what's being done and maybe what needs to be done, and take a stand. One of the approaches that has often been expressed as an alternative way to deal with our own footprint is 4 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle, recover. Reduce, buy products packaged in recycled materials or purchase products that have less packaging. Reuse, when possible, repair items instead of purchasing new ones. Recycle, collect, reprocess, market, and use materials once considered trash. Recover, refurbish old computers, for example, or salvage parts. Another approach is what's known as the four laws of ecology. Here they are one at a time. 1. Everything is connected to everything else. And this becomes a really important part. The world, as we understand it and as we know it, is a closed system. Now, what do I mean by a closed system? For example, fresh water. Fresh water is neither created nor is it endless. And that's an important piece. Because it's a closed system, the fresh water we have on Earth is all the fresh water we have. It gets recycled. It either gets evaporated up into the clouds, creates rain, falls back down. But once we use water and destroy it, and I'll use this as an example, the tar sands in Canada, the water that's used to help generate and loosen and soften the frozen oil in the earth, once it's brought to the surface, that water is so contaminated, bitumen I think it's called, it can't be used again, it can't be recycled, and it can't be reused. That's fresh water disappearing. So a closed system just means that whatever's here is what's here. It just gets recirculated, cleaned, recirculated, cleaned. It gets recirculated. 2. Everything must go somewhere. Waste and garbage either feeds another organism, bacteria, worms, other organism, or it does not. If it does not, it has to go somewhere. Now, if you've watched any videos or check out the gyres, that's G-R-Y-E-S, these are the huge plastic islands, if you will, that are circulating around the ocean. There's between 5 and 7 of them. 1 or 2 of them are the size of Texas, and it's just plastic. If it's not eaten by organisms, where does it go? Some of it ends up in the ocean. 3. Nature knows best. Bacteria, enzymes, fungi, and other natural organisms will break down organic compounds. However, we have created things that cannot be broken down. And 4, there's no such thing as a free lunch. Every technological gain has an ecological cost. Water, air, or land pollution, and its associated effects on you and I, or our food, as an example. So in closing, and it's only part 1, we'll do part 2 in a moment. Try calculating your ecological footprint online. You'll find on page 433 4 different ways of evaluating, calculating. It's not a way of going, oh my God, I'm so bad, or oh my God, I'm so good. It's about being more aware. And maybe there are things that you can do as an individual or collectively to make a difference on your ecological footprint on Earth, or our perspective on how we can all take management of our environment. All right, that's the end of part 1. Let's look to part 2, and we'll look at the health implications that some of these issues have. All right, thank you everybody. Good luck. We're almost there. Bye now.